Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This is Muhammad Hassan Shafiq, and today we will continue the online series for biology grade 12. We will continue, this is the lecture 10, and we will continue with unit 17, which is nervous coordination. Today the topics which we will be covering today are the central nervous system and the working of sensory receptors in humans. So these both topics are very interesting. They have a very important role in coordination and are also very important from an examination point of view as well. So moving on to today's lecture, starting with the nervous system. The nervous system is divided primarily into the central nervous system, which constitutes the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which involves the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. The peripheral nervous system usually carries the messages to and from the central nervous system. It is divided into the somatic and autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system controls the voluntary muscles and transmits sensory information to the central nervous system. On the other hand, the autonomic nervous system controls the involuntary body functions, which may be either under sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system arouses body to expend energy, like it involves the processes which usually involve the expenditure of energy, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which calms the body to conserve and maintain energy. So these two systems from their function appear to be quite antagonistic to each other. Moving on to the basic organization of the human nervous system. The human nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord and the peripheral nervous system, which we have already talked about. Moving to the central nervous system, the central nervous system is the system which involves the processing, the information processing, and the central unit of this information processing is the brain. The brain is a very important organ of our body and acts as a command and control system. The functions which it controls include the voluntary movements, the balance, as well as the functioning of vital involuntary organs like the heart, kidney, and lungs, etc. Thermoregulation, which involves the maintenance of body temperature, the hunger and thirst, as well as the 24-hour rhythmic events of our body, the activities of certain endocrine glands, and the human behavior. It is also the site for processing of vision, hearing, speech, memory, intelligence, emotions, and thoughts. Since as far as the functions are concerned, it appears to be a very important processing organ, so it has to be carefully protected, and this protection is done by the cranial meninges, which consists of an outer layer of durameter, a very thin middle layer called the arachnoid, and an inner layer which is in contact with the brain tissue called the pyometer. The brain can be divided into three major parts: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. So the three meninges which are actually covering the brain are the durameter, like I just said. This durameter is next to the cranium. Arachnoid is the middle membrane, and the pyometer is pretty much next to the nervous tissue. Like it said, it is very much in contact with the brain tissue as well. Between the arachnoid and the pyometer, there is a fluid called the cerebrospinal fluid, the CSF, which helps to cushion the brain from shock. This is a diagrammatic representation of the brain. Like you can see that major parts, the forebrain, midbrain, and the hindbrain. We will talk about this in detail. The three major parts are the forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain, and these can be further divided further as well. So starting on with the first part of the brain, which is the forebrain. The forebrain consists of the cerebrum, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. The cerebrum forms the major part of the human brain. A deep cleft divides the cerebrum longitudinally into two halves, which are termed as the left and right cerebral hemispheres. which are connected to each other by a band of axons called corpus callosum. The layer of cells which covers the cerebral hemisphere is called the cerebral cortex and is thrown into prominent folds. The cerebral cortex is referred to as the grey matter due to its greyish appearance. The neuron cell bodies are concentrated here, giving the color. The cerebral cortex contains motor areas, sensory areas, and large regions that are neither clearly sensory nor motor in function. And these regions are called the association areas, which are responsible for complex functions like intersensory associations, memory, and communication. Fibers of the tracts are covered with myelin sheath, which constitute the inner part of cerebral hemisphere. So the outer part usually appears grayish, the cerebral cortex, due to the abundance of cell bodies, while the inner region is pretty much the myelinated region. So they give these fibers give an opaque white appearance to the layer, and hence is called the white matter, which is pretty much on the inner side. The cerebrum wraps around a structure called thalamus, which is the major coordinating center for sensory and motor signaling. So most of the sensory information from the sense organs happens to pass through the brain and reach the thalamus. Another very important region of the let's talk a little bit more about the thalamus. It is below the cerebrum, and it receives all sensory impulses except that of smell and channels them to the limbic system. The limbic system is a complex set of structures that lies on both sides of the thalamus, just under the cerebrum. It includes the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and several other nearby areas. So one of these areas is the hypothalamus, which is very important in a way that it contains a number of centers which control body temperature. So the hypothalamus contains neurons which interpret the signals for thermoregulation, the urge for eating and drinking. It also contains several groups of neurosecretory cells which secrete hormones called hypothalamic hormones. So this region of the brain not only has important neural functions but also chemically links the neural and chemical coordination, as it also has regions for secretion of hypothalamic hormones. So it might secrete certain factors which will activate certain other endocrine glands, which will then secrete their respective hormones. The inner parts of cerebral hemispheres and a group of associated deep structures like amygdala, hippocampus form a complex structure called the limbic lobe or limbic system. Along with the hypothalamus, it is involved in the regulation of sexual behavior, the expression of emotional reactions like excitement, pleasure, rage, fear, and motivation. Next is the midbrain. The other part of this forebrain is the amygdala. One of the parts is the amygdala, which has two almond-shaped masses of neurons on either sides of the hypothalamus at the lower end of hippocampus, right? And like I said, they involve feelings of love, hate, fear, and rage. The hippocampus consists of two horns that curve back from the amygdala. They appear to be very important in converting things that are in your mind at the moment into things that you will remember for a very long time, like long-term memory. Midbrain is pretty much reduced in humans and is located between the thalamus of the forebrain and the pons, which is one of the part of the hindbrain. A canal called the cerebral aqueduct passes through the midbrain. The dorsal portion of the midbrain consists mainly of four round swellings called corpora quadrigemina. Midbrain and hindbrain form the brain stem. So what we can say is that the midbrain actually is not very important functionally, but it does act as a relay station for tracts passing between the cerebrum and the spinal cord or cerebellum. Midbrain also contains reticular formation, which is a relay center connecting the hindbrain with the forebrain, which we just talked about. The third and last part of the brain is the hindbrain, which comprises the pons, cerebellum, and medulla oblongata. Pons acts as a bridge between the cerebellum, medulla, and cerebrum. It also controls the rate and pattern of heartbeat and breathing. So it consists of fiber tracts that interconnect different regions of the brain as well. Cerebellum controls equilibrium, which is the body position and coordination of the actions of individual muscles to produce complex activities such as walking, running, riding, cycling, doing delicate work with hand as well. The cerebellum is also involved in learning, memory storage for behavior. And it also provides additional space for many more neurons as well. Like it is one of the biggest regions of by volume inside the brain. The medulla, which is the third part, controls the automatic functions of the body like respiration, cardiovascular reflexes, heartbeat, blood pressure, swallowing, and your gastric secretions as well. Brain is a hollow structure, as it has cavities called ventricles, and there are 4 ventricles in the brain as well. So this was all about the human brain. Okay, the brain is one of the most important coordinating centers. Okay, and besides that brain, the second part of the nervous system, before we talk about how sensory receptors are processed in humans, we will just generally talk about the peripheral nervous system, which involves the cranial and spinal nerves. The cranial nerves arise from the cranium, and the spinal region from the other rest of the body, from the spinal cord moving down. They are all mixed nerves. They provide two-way communication between the spinal cord and parts of the arms, legs, neck, and trunk. Each spinal nerve emerges from the spinal cord by 2 short branches or roots which lie within the vertebral column. The dorsal root contains the fibers of sensory information which conducts impulses to the spinal cord. The other regions, the somatic and autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system consists of the cranial and spinal nerve fibers that connect the central nervous system to the skin and skeletal muscles and is involved in conscious activities. The autonomic nervous system includes those fibers that connect the CNS to the visceral internal organs such as the heart, stomach, intestines, and various glands. It is concerned with unconscious activities. The autonomic nervous system is divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, which function automatically and subconsciously in an involuntary manner. So the sympathetic nervous system consists of various automatic functions during the state of emergency. It prepares the body for flight and fight responses. The parasympathetic nervous system involves a few cranial nerves, including the vagus nerve, together that are with nerves that arise from the sacral nerve to form the spinal cord. So now we will talk about the sensory receptors and their working, that how do actually sensory receptors in the body work. So before talking about how action potentials are generated in chemoreceptors, we should know that the body must detect what is occurring inside and outside the body and is performed by sensory receptors, like we all know, and these receptors are present in the sense organs, but here we will be talking about the sense organ of taste, that is the tongue, which includes receptors for smell, taste, and how an action potential is generated in these receptors. The taste buds, primarily on the surface of the tongue, like you can see, are associated with tiny elevations called papillae. Each taste bud includes a group of modified epithelial cells, the taste cells, which function as receptors. The taste cell has an opening, the taste pore, on its free surface. Tiny projections called taste heads protrude from the ends of taste cells and just protrude through the taste pore. Generally talking, how an action potential is generated here. Uh, the entry of sodium ions, right? Like the stimulus can be the sodium in food. It depolarizes the membrane in the sensory zone, which stimulates the calcium ion channels, which we talked about in the previous lectures, that how calcium regulates the fusing of certain vesicles containing neurotransmitters by exocytosis towards the presynaptic membrane. If the stimulation is above the threshold, impulses travel to the brain along with the sensory neuron, and you will get that particular information about the food or stimulus you just felt. This is how your taste or your tongue or different regions of the tongue are sensitive to different tastes. Uh, Before moving to drugs, we will also talk about some other receptors which are present on the surface of your skin. One of them are the Meissner corpuscles and Merkel discs. These are touch receptors. They consist of small oval masses of flattened connective tissue cells. Two or more sensory nerve fibers branch into each corpuscle. They act as tiny knobs. One of the other receptors which lie quite deep inside the dermis, particularly at the knee joints, are the Pacinian corpuscles, which receive the stimulus for deep pressure. The receptors for touch and pressure are also called mechanoreceptors. Pain receptors are called nociceptors and are also located at the top of the skin in the dermis area to detect pain. These are how and regarding taste buds, your tongue is designed to different tastes in such a way that uh, your tongue can detect different tastes. Like the tip is usually sensitive to sweet, the lateral sides to salt, on the back side of the tongue are to sour, and on the back of the tongue the buds sensitive to bitter taste are present. On the uniform central area of the tongue, you see savory taste buds, which are usually sensitive to the stimulus of taste. So these are how different buds are present in the tongue, which you can also see these receptors, the distribution of these receptors on the page 85 of your biology book. Moving on, regarding brain, we must talk about certain factors which affect the functioning of a brain, and one of the major groups of substances which when administered affect the functioning or the processing of the brain are drugs. A drug can be defined as any substance taken into the body that modifies or affects chemical reactions in the body. The drug may be one taken legally to reduce a symptom such as a headache or to treat a bacterial infection. So such drugs which are taken to reduce the symptoms of a disease or treat a bacterial infection are called medicinal drugs. But it could also be one taken often illegally to provide stimulation or induce sleep or create hallucinations, and such drugs come under recreational drugs, right? So they just deviate from their original functioning of treatment of a disease. Instead, they start inducing sleep and create effects called hallucinations. Drugs are also present in many products such as naturally occurring tea, coffee, and energy drinks, caffeine, tobacco, nicotine, and alcoholic drinks. Alcohol, which although legal, can cause serious effects when taken excessively over extended periods of time. When I'm talking about legality of alcohol, obviously I'm talking about the West, since it's permissible. It's not like halal, obviously, in Islam. We as Muslims are not allowed to take this, but in the West, since we're talking from a general perspective, uh, that's why it's written legal, like it's of when I'm talking about the West. So terms related to drugs are drug addiction and drug tolerance. Drug addiction is the dependence of an illegal drug or medication. and drug tolerance is a person's diminished response to a drug. Uh, Regarding brain functioning, narcotics or a narcotic is a group of substances which, when administered, diminish the perception of pain. Narcotics bind to certain pain killing sites in the brain. With constant use, they build up in the brain and block the production of endorphins, the brain's natural pain killing chemicals. Their side effects are inhibition of the endocrine and autonomous nervous system. The narcotics are the drugs that act as agents which interact with the normal nervous activity, right? So these are the pain pleasure inducing chemicals released by the brain and are the brain's natural pain killing chemicals. So these endorphins are like secreted under certain conditions and apparently give a good feeling to the body. Last topic of today's slide is narcotic drugs. The common narcotic drugs are cannabis, nicotine, and alcohol. Besides this, we have heroin and certain inhalants as well. Let's talk about them a little bit. Let's start with heroin. It gives a feeling of euphoria along with relief of pain. Side effects can include nausea, we might see vomiting, respiratory and circulatory depression leading to death. Cannabis, they are the dried flowering tops, leaves, and stems of an Indian hemp plant, the Cannabis sativa. It includes marijuana and hashish. Intoxication is recognized by the presence of hallucinations, anxiety, and depression. Nicotine is an alkaloid derived from tobacco. When smoking a cigarette, nicotine is quickly distributed to all body organs. In the peripheral nervous system, nicotine stimulates postsynaptic receptors, like one of them which we talked about during synapse was acetylcholine, and leads to increased skeletal muscle activity. So nicotine leads to increased skeletal muscle activity by stimulating postsynaptic receptors. So obviously when the impulse will be conducted rapidly, it will lead to increased or enhanced muscle activity as well. It also increases the heartbeat and the blood pressure. Alcohol is primarily metabolized in the liver, where it disrupts the normal working of glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. So one of the major intermediate steps of respiration are glycolysis and Krebs cycle, which are interrupted in the liver by the presence of alcohol. The pH of the blood decreases and it becomes acidic. For fat accumulation, the first stage of liver deterioration begins immediately. There is an increased risk of cardiac arrhythmias and stroke. So your cardiac cycle activities also get affected, the rhythmicity is affected, and you might lead to stroke in future as well. Withdrawal symptoms of alcohol refer to a group of symptoms that may occur from suddenly stopping the usage of alcohol. The symptoms are feeling of nervousness, shakiness, anxiety, irritability, rapid emotional changes, headache, pulsating, sweating, a state of confusion, and hallucinations, visual hallucinations, that is. So these can also be seen like you might undergo depression or fatigue as well. But obviously, if you're living or withdrawing the usage of alcohol, your body will might notice these symptoms initially, but in the long run, obviously, you'll get your body cured for a very good cause. Inhalants, they can be defined as volatile organic chemicals, commonly referred to as glue sniffing. The inhalants abuse include aerosols, for example, hairsprays or anesthetics. For example, like commonly employed anesthetic is ether, right? Which are a group of organic compounds. Inhalants provide an instant rush and, like alcohol, cause euphoria followed by the central nervous system depression. Deep breathing of these toxic vapors may result in a loss of appetite and a higher dose, and at higher dose it might cause hallucinations as well. So this was all for today, in which we talked about the central nervous system regarding the brain and the spinal cord. We talked about gray matter and white matter. Do please consider all these topics from the book, as most of the reading we did today was from the book. Brain is a very important question asked from an examination point of view. Do study the drugs, their toxicity effects, and the narcotic drugs. We also talked about coordination and how sensory receptors work, or how a receptor, like, this is just for taste, which we mentioned today. All the receptors usually work through the same way by generating an action potential, which will then trigger a different area of the brain and reach the thalamus, except for the receptors for smell. So this was all for today. We will continue unit 17 and end it soon, inshallah, in the coming chapters. We will also talk about more topics, and I will keep giving you lectures for the different topics regarding this, regarding nervous coordination as well. So keep studying biology, stay safe, and I'll see you all soon again in the next lecture. Allah Hafiz.